Genesis 48. It's funny how as you get older, you think about being older a different way. The title of this sermon is Faith in Mature Saints. Used to be something I looked forward to. Now I hope it's something that I'm actually experiencing. There was a story in the newspaper a number of years ago about an 82-year-old lady who was going to cross the street, and she entered the crosswalk when the light was green. Didn't make it all the way across before it went red. Motorcycle policeman stopped her and gave her a $115 ticket. 82-year-old lady with her cane. Now most of us would go, well, that's just unjust. Said, well, she was obstructing traffic. She said, he treated me like I was a 6-year-old. Sometimes that's what happens when you get older. You get treated like a 6-year-old. And one of the things that the Bible points us toward is that as we grow older and as we mature in the Lord, that we grow older differently from the world. So often, small self-centerednesses, small ways of thinking of yourself, small ways of negotiating life, navigating life, and negotiating relationships ends up being, well, just self-focused. But we have ways of masking it and hiding it. But as we get older, and we become, well, less willing or even able to hide all those little ways in which we organize life around us. And instead of being sweet and gracious older Christians, well, we find relationships fracturing and people distancing, and it becomes more difficult. And sometimes it's not because we are just old, but because we are 70, 60, 80, and we act like 6-year-olds. And it's difficult. And the disconnect between what you see and what you're experiencing is so hard. I heard people say that as they got older, they looked in the mirror one morning and realized, who is that guy in the mirror? Unfortunately, I have that experience pretty regularly. I don't know who that white-headed guy is in the mirror. After all, I'm looking out through 20-year-old eyes. Now, maybe I need help, but my experience and knowing older, sweeter saints and seeing how God had brought about in their life just this sense of being mature and gracious and holding fast. Because, sometimes what happens is as we get older, we lose our grip on our courage to hold fast to what we believe. Now, sometimes we just become hardened. And our minds become like steel traps. They snap closed anytime anything new enters them. And what we want then, biblically, is to be a kind of people who are stable and mature and not blown about by every wind of doctrine. So that is not only true of spiritual maturity, but it is true of personal maturity. And as we look at our text this morning, we do find that old age can bring about decline and difficulties. We find ourselves wondering over our lives. Sometimes we just find ourselves, what was it all about? This is not what I expected. This is not what I wanted. How many people enter into retirement only to discover that, boy, it is not at all what it was cut out to be. And many struggled with an unfulfilled life, with hopes that have never been met and expectations that are withering away. And many carry with them bitterness, comes out of loneliness and pains. The problems of the past become magnified, and the mistakes in life are replayed over and over again with vain regret. I don't think any of us want to become a soured saint. But what an example a seasoned and stable faith is amidst of such challenges. When men and women age with grace, they see God evermore, not just in the world that they are coming to, but also in the world that they are preparing to leave. The Bible becomes richer. God's truth becomes more contoured. Hardships are accepted, in fact, even triumphed in. This is all what we all want to aim for, to become seasoned saints. As we come to the end of Jacob's life, we've seen how he seems to have struggled with the long hardships of his life in its seeming shortness at 130 years old. I think he's twice as old as I am. That's old. And at a time that God has resolved so many of his griefs, he seems to find so little to be glad about. Yet, Moses highlights how in the midst of this, a great blessing is conveyed. And it was visible even in their day. For you see, there is no tribe of Joseph, is there? Ever thought about that? Among the 12 sons, there's no tribe of Joseph. Why is that? What happened? This text is about how that happened. And gloriously, even Jacob begins to show evidence of faith as a mature saint. First, we see that he acknowledges the promises of God in verses 1 to 7. Joseph is informed that his father is very ill and is expected to die. Begins with news from home in verses 1 and 2. And after this, Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is ill." And so he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And it was told to Jacob, "Your son Joseph has come to you." And then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. So Joseph gathers up 2 of his sons and comes to his father's house. He waits outside while his servant quietly rouses the old man and tells him Joseph is there with his 2 boys. As any father would, he rouses himself and sits up, pulling up his covers and shifting his pillows to be able to sit comfortably and to lean on his staff. Joseph enters to stand by his father's bed, and Jacob looks at them and then begins to exalt the God who has provided for them. Jacob's present faith in God recognizes the past promises that God had given. In verse 3, Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, 'Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession.' And now your 2 sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, they are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. And the children that you fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. And as for me, when I came from Paddan, to my sorrow Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrathah. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is, to Bethlehem. That is Bethlehem. So there's a word from God, verses 3 through 4. God had spoken to Jacob in a time where there was no written scripture. This was large in the life of the early Old Testament saints. God had given his word to Jacob. This word was true and was to be believed. And in believing it, it was to be acted on as well. God had confirmed the covenant to Jacob, but in the context of Joseph standing at his bedside, Jacob focuses on the promise of being fruitful and multiplying. In his word to Jacob, God had affirmed his covenant promise to enlarge his family and bring forth a vast multitude of descendants that would become a great nation. They are on the threshold of the first phase of that promise's fulfillment. But then we also see it in the kindness of grace. Verses 5 and 6. And a startling act of kindness and grace arising from faith in God's word and promises, Jacob speaks his own promise to Joseph. Rather than pass on the inheritance to Joseph, Jacob will adopt Joseph's two sons. Jacob will magnify Joseph's standing by making Joseph's two sons his own sons. He will then give each of them a portion among all the brothers. The effect of this then is to give Joseph a double portion. But he must be willing to give them up and to have them named as Jacob's sons. The rest of Joseph's children fathered after these two boys will be Joseph's own sons in his own name. But then we see this acknowledgement of the promises of God in the midst of grief. Why does he do this? Because he sees the sons of Joseph as the unexpected provision of God in the midst of his long sadness. Jacob, after all these years, still has an empty place in his heart for Rachel. In the way he phrases this, he sees her as dying while there was still a long way to go. He wanted so much for more children by her, but God took her. And now he sees that Joseph's boys can become the rest of the sons that Rachel never had. How often will Israel's hopes be dashed like Jacob's on the way to Bethlehem? There will be dark years of trial and testing and hardship. There will be times when it will seem so hard to see that boy that will one day be born in Bethlehem of Ephrathah. But faith clings strong to God's promises, and even in the dimming eyesight of old age, the heart sees clearly what God has said. It is no wonder then that two old people, Simeon and Anna, will rejoice with a long and patient waiting faith to see the boy in Bethlehem born. And he not only acknowledges the promises of God, but Jacob acknowledges the purposes of God in verses 8 through 20. For you see, the faith of mature saints acts in accordance to the purposes of God. Jacob's eyes may only see the world around him dimly, but his heart sees the heaven above so clearly. How does he do that? First, by the adoption of the boys, verses 8 to 14. From the promise to adopt, we now move to the ceremony of adoption itself. Verse 8, when Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" And Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons, whom God has given me here." And he said, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. So Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face. And behold, God has let me see your offspring also." Then Joseph removed them from his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim on the right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh on his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. Now notice here, once again, the shifting back and forth of Jacob's name. Even in this text, he's sometimes called Jacob and sometimes referred to as Israel. In this, though, our author Moses is being careful to note that Jacob is not being a schemer. And what he is going to do, he is acting as Israel. He is acting as the father of nations. He is acting as the representative of God's covenant. He is Israel, who strives or engages with God and prevails. So these two boys are going to become a part, not just of Jacob's family, but also they will be a part of Israel. They will be enumerated among the tribes. The adoption ceremony opens with the father asking for their identity of the sons. Because his eyesight is poor, he is confirming the identity of these two boys. After all, he does have plucking at the hem of his conscience that he took advantage of his father's own blindness to gain the inheritance. So the "who are these" is like a wedding ceremony. Who presents this woman to be married? It is the formal and ceremonial identification of the person and their family. And Joseph responds with the confirmation of who they are in a ceremonial presentation of them for adoption. "These are my sons. They are God's gift to me. These are the fruit of the covenant God gave to Jacob. These are not Joseph's to do as he pleases." But Jacob and Joseph are recognizing the purpose of God to bless Joseph, even as his dreams foretold. God calls them forward to name them as his own sons by blessing he conveys upon them. He kisses them, he hugs them, and he peers with dimness and delight into their faces. What a wonderful sentence this is, for Jacob's sad heart moves now into hope. I never thought I'd see your face again. And now God has allowed me to see the faces of your sons. Joseph sets the boys down and bows to the earth, acknowledging the purposes of God in the adoption of his sons. He stands them formally before Israel so that they can be blessed. Knowing his father's blindness and possibly lack of familiarity with the boys, he strategically places them with Manasseh on Jacob's right and Ephraim on his left. Manasseh is his oldest and therefore should be under the right hand of prominence in receiving the blessing from Jacob. Again, this is not manipulation. This is just careful attention to detail, knowing the circumstance of his father's failing eyesight. He just puts the correct boy in the correct place in front of his father. But then, In a startling move, Jacob leans toward the boys and crosses his hands. His right hand now is on the head of Ephraim and his left on the head of Manasseh. He knows on whom the main blessing should rest, just as he, the younger, had been given the blessing over the elder. So he intended and determined to do so with Joseph's sons. Now we see this too in his blessing on the son. Then he blesses Joseph, verse 15 and 16. And he blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day." Do you hear a different tone than in front of the Pharaoh? "The angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys, and in them let my name be carried on, the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." I love this. Can't you see the scene in your mind's eye? See Jacob, old and firm and weak and ill, with eyes looking off into eternity. See two young boys standing at his bedside, their father behind them. See Jacob's arms crossed with his hands on their heads, and hear the blessing of Joseph by Jacob upon these two adopted sons. And in the blessing, Jacob invokes God in three significant ways. First, he is the God who has shepherded Jacob his whole life long. What an acknowledgement. This is richer than it seems. Here is a shepherd who sees God as his shepherd and all the richness of what it would have meant to him. God has been his guard and guide, his protector and provider all his days. And even when he is struggling with sin and its consequence, God has been with him and has brought him safely to this very place of blessing. And God is shepherding even in the very details of this passing moment of blessing. And secondly, he acknowledges and highlights God as the angel who has redeemed Jacob from Israel. The Lord is my shepherd. The Lord is my redeemer. Here is a wonderful double meaning. He uses a word that at one level means that God has delivered him from or out of the evils around him. But the word also means that God has delivered him from the evil that he has done and that he does. God is a deliverer and God is a redeemer. The reference to God as this redeeming angel points back to specific times in his life where the angel of the Lord, the pre-incarnate Christ, had appeared to him. And it points forward to the coming Redeemer who delivers all of God's people from their sin and their sins. In the blessing, Jacob invokes the covenant in two significant ways. May they be blessed in the perpetuating of the family name. Through these boys, the purpose of God to magnify himself by extending their fame and reputation would unfold. Not just through them alone, but certainly through them as well. The covenant blessing would be extended, and may they be blessed in the growing into a great multitude. While the covenant sees all the sons of Abraham as becoming a great nation and a greater multitude, Jacob's blessing invokes that for these two sons and for their descendants. Over the long years, this blessing unfolds as Ephraim becomes the largest and wealthiest of what would become the northern tribes. And then by his elevation of the younger in verses 17 through 20. Now, Joseph notices the placing of the hands. Verse 17, when Joseph saw that his father's right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, and he took the father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not this way, my father, since this one is firstborn, and your right hand should be on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." So he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will pronounce blessings, saying, "God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh." Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Joseph is upset. Jacob, in spite of his care, has gotten it wrong. "Here, Dad, your hands are crossed and the right hand is on the wrong boy. Here, let me help you. You're a 6-year-old. You don't know what you're doing. You're 130. You can't see." And he reaches out and switches Jacob's hands, or tries to. But by faith, Jacob has discerned the true purposes and patterns of God's ways. He knows that he has reversed his hands, and he's done it on purpose. Don't move them. Leave them as they are. For this is God's way. This is God's purpose. You see, all through the Bible, God has purpose to elevate the younger over the elder. We saw this in Genesis with Seth over Cain. Isaac is the true son over Ishmael, the older. Jacob is chosen over Esau, the elder. David, the second regent, will establish his line over Saul, the first king. David, the youngest of his brothers, will become the king of the nation. The new covenant is established as the old covenants are fulfilled and fade and now are finished. And the first heavens and the first earth will be ended, and righteousness will flourish in the new heavens and new earth. This is the way of God. These are the very purposes of God. And it is like this so that God may frustrate the wisdom and the way of the world. Israel will one day turn this surprising blessing into its invocation. The Irish are famous for their wry and witty blessings. We've lost much in that we do not know how to give, and much less how to receive blessing words. But among the Israelites and among the people of God, this will become an illustration of faith, an invocation of blessing, and an invitation into the covenant. May God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh. And so he acknowledges the providence of God. Here, brothers and sisters, are the acknowledgments, the commitments, the affirmations of a mature saint, to acknowledge the promises of God, to acknowledge the purposes of God, and to submit to the providences of God. Verse 21 through 22. The faith of a mature saint sees behind the veil of outward circumstances the hidden but powerfully working hand of God. Verse 21. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Behold, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you rather than to your brothers one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow." So Jacob's future blessing of Joseph and his tribes rest in the kind providences of God. And so, he acknowledges the providence of God in God's presence with them. There's no sweeter place to rest in the last days of life than the assurance of God's presence and promises. Yes, Jacob is about to die, but all that he has hoped in and banked on does not flicker out in the twilight of life. No, it's a bright flame that is passed on with deep assurance to his son. God will be with Joseph, and God will be with his people, just as God has been with Jacob all these long years, and now in these last moments. The past promises of God that have sustained Jacob also assure Joseph that they will return to the land that was promised them. And so he acknowledges the providence of God in the present of the land to Joseph. Here are the victories that he has won, the land that he has gained. In a play on the word Shechem, Jacob bequeaths to Joseph this mountain-sloped town and district which he has fought for and won by war. So Joseph, and later Israel, are hereby warned that the promises of God that bring them surely back to the land are going to necessitate the sword and the bow under God's providences. They will have to win the land that they have been promised. So why have we talked today about Jacob's actions here arising from faith? How can we say that his is the faith of a mature saint? How do we say that? Where do I get that? Because Hebrews 11:21 says, by faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Jacob did what he did. Jacob's blessing is by faith. He is acting on what he knows to be true. He knows the purposes, the promises, and the providences of God through the Word. And this is an act of worship, Hebrews tells us. This leaning on his staff and adopting Joseph's boys is an act of blessing. Joseph is an act of blessing Joseph, all because he believes God in an obeying way. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying. May God cause us in the twilights of life to be men and women whose gentleness and sweetness and faith will magnify our great God. May we speak much of his great promises that he has fulfilled and others that we are eagerly awaiting. May we speak much of his great purposes, some of which consider the wisdom of the world and thus counter the wisdom of the world and thus cause us to delight in his intricate and surprising ways. May we speak much of his providences, his hand on our lives. May we help others to be blessed by our words and our ways. May we help others to arrive home with gracious and godly dignity. And we are like Ephraim and Manasseh, for we have been brought into God's spiritual family as heirs, not in the place of another, but because of another. Because of a Bethlehem-born Redeemer. Like Joseph, Jesus is magnified by the untold multiplication of honor that comes when all of the saints are named as his joint heirs. In the vast and limitless wealth of God, Jesus is not receiving less because of this. And his honor is ever so much greater. Thus, God's love for his children is primarily about making much of Jesus Christ. And finally, as recipients of the new, the greater and magnificent in the surprising purposes of God, I wish you this blessing. May God grant you to be as Ephraim and Manasseh. Sola Deo Gloria. Father, with humbled hearts, we bow before you. Oh, how we long to stand before you and bow before you as the blessed ones brought into your family by your promises and your purposes and your providence, as ones who are double blessed, as ones who are recipients of the new, as the younger over the elder, as the later over the before, as looking forward in this old world to the new world to come. And as we grow older, grant us the grace and the honor and the humility and the sweetness and the joy of growing old with grace to become true seasoned saints. We ask all of this for all of us in Jesus' name. Amen.